The boarding gate for Flight 417 felt like a different world. Polished shoes clicked against the terminal floor. Rolling luggage gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Men and women in tailored suits stood in clusters near the priority lane, checking their watches, adjusting their cufflinks, conducting final calls before disconnecting from whatever deal or meeting had consumed the last 48 hours of their lives. Everything about the scene whispered money and belonging, the easy, unconscious posture of people who had never once questioned whether they deserved to be somewhere. And then Marcus Reed walked through the door. He carried a single backpack, worn at the straps. His jacket was a deep olive canvas, faded at the elbows, the kind of coat that had been through too many winters and too many early mornings to hold its shape anymore. His work boots, still laced tight, bore the marks of decades on concrete floors, grease stains that had outlasted a dozen scrubbings, scuffs that told the story of a man who had spent his life fixing things with his hands. He was 52 years old, broad-shouldered but lean, and his face carried the quiet weathering of someone who had worked outdoors and indoors and everywhere in between. Someone who had never had the luxury of being idle. He looked, to anyone who glanced at him for the first time, like a man who had taken a wrong turn somewhere between baggage claim and the economy concourse. He had not taken a wrong turn. Marcus set his backpack down near a seat in the priority boarding area and lowered himself into it with the careful deliberateness of a body that had spent the previous 11 hours underneath the engine compartment of a 30-year-old cargo plane at a regional maintenance facility, 40 minutes outside the city. He had come straight from work. He had not showered. He had grabbed a sandwich from a vending machine near the employee exit and eaten it standing up in the parking lot while calling a cab, because his truck was in for repairs and he had not wanted to be late. He had made it to the gate with 22 minutes to spare. He considered that a success. Around him, the other passengers in the priority boarding zone registered his presence, the way people register something slightly out of place, not with alarm, but with a certain trained narrowing of attention. A woman in a cream blazer glanced at his boots, then away. A younger man in a slim-cut suit studied him for a moment over the rim of his phone screen, then returned to whatever he had been reading. A couple near the window spoke quietly, and one of them cast a glance in his direction that carried all the weight of an unspoken assessment. No one spoke to him. No one smiled. The silence directed at Marcus was not hostile exactly, but it had texture. It had weight. It was the specific kind of silence that communicates, very efficiently, that you are being assessed and that the assessment is not going in your favor. Marcus noticed it the way he had noticed it 1,000 times before. He had grown up in a neighborhood where certain kids got watched more closely in corner stores. He had applied for jobs where interviewers looked at his address before they looked at his resume. He had attended school meetings where other parents angled their chairs slightly away from him, or talked over him, or smiled the brittle, performative smile that people use when they are tolerating rather than welcoming. He had been judged by his clothes, his truck, his zip code, the way he talked, the way he walked, the roughness of his hands. He had a whole taxonomy of it by now: the quick scan, the slow look, the polite dismissal, the outright rudeness. He filed this particular moment under quick scan and let it go. What no one in that boarding area knew, what no one would have guessed from the canvas jacket, or the worn boots, or the single faded backpack, was that Marcus Reed had, over the course of the past 23 years, quietly and without fanfare, changed the trajectory of more lives than most people in that terminal would ever touch. He had done it not through wealth or power or connection, but through the kind of stubborn, daily, unremarkable generosity that rarely makes it into any story anyone thinks to tell. He had done it while working 3 jobs simultaneously. He had done it while raising a daughter alone, without a partner, without a safety net, without anyone to call when things got hard at 2 in the morning, and they always got hard at 2 in the morning. He had done it because he believed, in the marrow of his bones, that the only thing a person truly owned was what they gave away. He was 52 years old. His daughter had just graduated from medical school. He had never, not once in those 23 years, purchased a first-class ticket. Tonight, he had. When the gate agent called priority boarding, Marcus stood, slung his backpack over one shoulder, and joined the small line. The boarding pass on his phone showed seat 2A. He had stared at the price for a long time before clicking confirm. He had told himself he was allowed. He had told himself that his daughter's graduation and the quiet pride that had taken root somewhere behind his sternum and had not stopped growing since the moment she walked across that stage was worth one extravagance. One single trip where he sat at the front of the plane and watched the city fall away beneath him and felt, for a few hours, like the world had some softness in it left. He boarded the plane. The flight attendant at the cabin entrance was a woman in her mid-30s, professional and composed, with the practiced smile of someone who had greeted thousands of passengers and sorted them by tier without needing to think about it very hard. She looked at Marcus. She looked at the boarding pass he held out on his phone screen. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression, not quite a frown, but the facial equivalent of a hesitation. She scanned the pass. It confirmed, seat 2A. She smiled again, brisk and efficient, and waved him through. Marcus found his row without difficulty. The first-class cabin was quiet, filled with the soft ambient noise of passengers, settling in the click of overhead bins, the rustle of suit jackets being folded, the low murmur of conversation. The seats were wide and cream-colored, the kind that reclined into actual beds, with small reading lights angled over each headrest and a welcome card tucked into the magazine pocket. Marcus sat down in seat 2A and placed his backpack under the seat in front of him. He looked out the window at the tarmac. The last light of the evening was fading. He felt, briefly and unexpectedly, something very close to peace. It lasted approximately 4 minutes. The man in seat 2B was named Gerald Whitfield. He was 60 years old, a regional vice president of something in the financial sector, a man who had flown first class so many times that he had stopped seeing the cabin as a privilege and started seeing it as simply the correct environment for a person of his standing. He was reading something on a tablet when Marcus sat down beside him, and he looked up with the expression of a man who has been interrupted by something he did not order. He looked at Marcus's jacket. He looked at the backpack. His jaw tightened, barely, but enough. He did not say anything yet. He returned to his tablet. But his posture had changed, the subtle shift of a shoulder away, the almost architectural creation of distance between himself and the man in the next seat. He radiated displeasure the way a cold draft radiates from a window, quietly but unmistakably, and Marcus felt it without needing to look. The flight attendant returned to the row several minutes later. She addressed both passengers with equal courtesy, offering pre-departure beverages. She was professional. She was kind, but when she turned to Marcus, there was a slight elongation to the pause before she spoke, a fraction of a second, in which her eyes moved over him, in a way that was not quite reading, and not quite suspicion, but was something uncomfortably close to both. She asked if he was comfortable. He said he was. She nodded and moved on. Then, a few minutes later, she came back. Alone. She leaned down slightly, her voice low, and she said, and her tone was careful, apologetic even, the way people speak when they are doing something they already know is wrong, but have talked themselves into doing anyway. She said she wanted to double-check his seat assignment, just to make sure everything was in order, just a formality. Marcus handed over his phone with the boarding pass visible. She looked at it. She looked at him. She said she was going to check with the gate system, just to confirm, and she moved away toward the front galley. Marcus watched her go. He heard her pick up the phone handset. He could not hear what she said, but he watched the set of her shoulders, and he understood that this was not a routine confirmation. Something else was happening. Gerald Whitfield, in seat 2B, had put his tablet down. He was watching openly now, with the expression of a man who is both disapproving and entertained. The way certain people look when they believe something they expected is about to be confirmed. A few rows back, a woman craned her neck. Someone across the aisle had gone very still with the specific alertness of someone who was trying to appear not to be paying attention while paying close attention. The flight attendant returned. Behind her was a man in a slightly different uniform. The cabin supervisor, a trim figure in his 40s, with close-cropped hair, and the practiced authority of someone who spent his days managing small crises before they became large ones. He came to Marcus's row with a neutral expression that was working hard to stay neutral. He introduced himself. He said there might be a discrepancy. He said he needed to verify a few things. He asked Marcus, very politely, if he would mind stepping out of his seat for a moment while they sorted it out. Marcus looked at him for a long beat. The cabin had gone quieter. The low-level ambient noise had not disappeared. But it had thinned. The way sound thins when many people in a room simultaneously decide to listen more carefully. Gerald Whitfield had not moved, but his attention was total. A few rows back, someone was holding a phone at a low angle that could have been coincidental, and was probably not. Marcus felt the heat of it, the specific, familiar burning of a humiliation that is conducted in public, that is polite enough to be deniable but unmistakable enough to be felt in every nerve. He thought of every moment he had stood in a doorway and been made to feel he did not belong. He thought of his daughter, sitting in a lecture hall on her first day of medical school in a coat that was slightly too large because they had bought it secondhand, and that was the size they had. He thought of every time he had swallowed something down and kept moving because there was no other option. He thought, not tonight. And then he thought, yes, tonight. Because the quiet was not surrender. The quiet was something else entirely. He stood up. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand to speak to a manager or invoke his rights or make a scene. He simply stood, calmly, and waited for whatever was going to happen next. Gerald Whitfield leaned back slightly in his seat, satisfied. The woman a few rows back murmured something to the person beside her. A man somewhere behind them said, not quite under his breath, I mean, did he really think he belonged up here? The cabin supervisor had positioned himself slightly to the side, creating a path toward the galley area. Marcus was about to take a step in that direction. He had decided, somewhere in the past 30 seconds, that he would wait this out, that the ticket was valid and the system would confirm it eventually, that he would stay polite and let it resolve without drama. He had been here before, in 100 different shapes, and he knew how to endure it. Then the cockpit door opened. The first officer, the co-pilot, stepped into the cabin. He was in his mid-40s, dark-haired, with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who had been trained to assess situations quickly. He moved toward the galley, then stopped. He had seen Marcus. He stopped completely. Not the pause of someone who has misidentified a stranger, but the full stop of someone who is looking at a face they have carried in memory for a very long time. His expression shifted through several things rapidly. Surprise, recognition, something that looked like disbelief. Marcus looked at him. It took a moment. The uniform, the setting, the years, and then something opened up in Marcus's face. The quiet recognition of someone who has not forgotten, but has stopped expecting. The co-pilot, his name was David Reeves, said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to the flight attendant and said something very quietly, his voice low and immediate. The flight attendant's expression changed. The cabin supervisor's certainty seemed to stall. Neither of them spoke. David looked once more at Marcus, something passing between them that had no words for it, and needed none. Then he turned and walked back toward the cockpit, pulling the door shut behind him. The cabin supervisor, to his credit, now looked genuinely uncertain. He turned to the flight attendant. A short, murmured exchange. The flight attendant looked at Marcus with an expression that had lost its officiousness and acquired something closer to discomfort. She told him he could return to his seat. Marcus returned to his seat. No announcement was made. No explanation was offered. Gerald Whitfield had taken up his tablet again, but his eyes were not moving across it. The woman who had craned her neck had turned back to face forward. The low murmur of conversation resumed, but it had a different quality now, quieter, provisional, the sound of people waiting for something without knowing what. Marcus sat in seat 2A and looked out the window at the darkening tarmac and thought about David Reeves. He had not seen David in more than 20 years. He had thought about him, sometimes, in the way you think about people who pass through your life during its hardest season, not with any particular urgency, but with a kind of wondering. He had never tried to find out what happened. He had hoped for the best. He had not imagined this. The story of David Reeves and Marcus Reed began 23 years earlier, in a maintenance hangar at a regional airport in Ohio, on a January morning so cold that the metal tools left burns on ungloved fingers. Marcus had been 30 years old. His wife, Diane, had died 14 months before a blood clot. Unexpected. Final. The kind of loss that removes the floor from under everything you thought was solid. He had a daughter, then 8 years old, named Cora. He had his job at the hangar, which paid enough to cover rent and groceries, and not quite enough to cover everything else. He had started picking up evening shifts at a parts warehouse and occasional weekend work at a body shop across town. He was tired in the specific, ground-down way of someone who has no margin left, who has reduced their life to its essential load-bearing elements and is holding all of them up at once. David Reeves had shown up at the hangar on a work-study program from a local community college. He was 20 years old, the son of a single mother who cleaned offices at night, a kid who had come to aviation, not through money or family connection, but through a borrowed library book about the physics of flight that he had read 3 times and returned creased at the spine. He wanted to become a commercial pilot. He was studying aerospace systems. He was brilliant in the specific way that people who arrive at a subject through passion rather than privilege are brilliant, not polished, not positioned, but deeply and genuinely committed in a way that the best teachers recognize instantly. He was, at the time he met Marcus, approximately 6 weeks away from dropping out. The problem was money. It was always money. His mother had been laid off from her cleaning job at a downtown office building after a contract renewal fell through, and she had spent the weeks since quietly working through their savings in a way she had not yet told David about, because she did not want him to worry about something he could not fix. His financial aid had a gap in it that the college's support office had been unable to bridge, despite 3 separate appeals. His car had died on the highway on a Tuesday morning in December, and without a car, he could not easily get to the hangar. And without the hangar hours, he could not complete his program, and without the program, he could not qualify for the flight school that had tentatively offered him a partial scholarship conditional on his academic standing. The whole structure of his future depended on a series of small things going right simultaneously, and they were not going right, and the compounding nature of the failures, each one tipping into the next, had brought David to a place where he was no longer fighting the tide so much as treading water, waiting to go under. He had begun to accept that this was simply how it was going to be, not with bitterness, exactly, but with the quiet devastation of someone watching a version of themselves disappear. Marcus had noticed David the way he noticed most things quietly, without making a production of it. He had watched the kid work. David was careful. He was precise. He asked good questions and listened to the answers with the full-body attention of someone who understood that every piece of knowledge might later save a life, possibly his own. He was the kind of young person whose seriousness was genuine, not performed, and Marcus had a sensitivity to that distinction that came from having been young and serious himself in circumstances that did not reward seriousness with anything except the chance to keep going. One evening in late January, Marcus had found David sitting alone in the break room after everyone else had left, staring at a sheet of paper with the look of someone calculating whether there was any combination of numbers that could add up to something bearable. Marcus had sat down across from him. He had asked what was going on. David had told him. Not everything. At first, the careful, abbreviated version that people offer when they are not sure whether the person across from them actually wants to hear it. But Marcus had asked follow-up questions, real ones, and eventually the whole thing came out. Marcus had listened. He had not offered sympathy in the thin, performative way that people offer it when they mean well, but have somewhere else to be. He had listened until David was finished. And then he had sat with it for a moment. And then he had said, "How much do you need?" David had told him. It was not a small number, relative to what Marcus earned. Marcus had said, "I can get you some of it now, and the rest by the end of next month." David had looked at him. He had said, "I can't take money from you." Marcus had said, "You're not taking it. I'm lending it. There's a difference. You pay me back when you're a pilot, and you can afford to." It was not only money. Over the following months, Marcus had driven David to the hangar on the days when his transportation fell through. He had spent evenings going over avionics concepts with him, working through the technical material the way you work through it when you're preparing for an exam that matters carefully, completely, without rushing past the parts that are hard. He had called in a favor from a mechanic he knew at a larger facility to get David access to a wider range of aircraft for his practical hours. He had done all of this without ever mentioning it to anyone, without ever treating it as something that deserved acknowledgement, because to Marcus, it was simply what you did when you saw someone who was trying and had the ability, and just needed someone to not look away. David Reeves had completed his program. He had earned the scholarship. He had gone to flight school. He had spent 15 years climbing the ranks of regional aviation before joining a major carrier. He was, now, a first officer on a fleet of wide-body commercial aircraft, with a captain's rating pending for the following spring. He had tried, more than once over the years, to track down Marcus Reed. And Marcus Reed had, as was his consistent practice, left no particular trail to follow. None of this was known to anyone in the first-class cabin of Flight 417. None of it was known to Gerald Whitfield, who was trying to read his tablet. None of it was known to the flight attendant, who was going through the beverage service with the slightly tighter expression of someone who knows they may have done something they will not be proud of. None of it was known to the captain, whose name was Captain Howard Ellis, 60 years old, silver-haired, 37 years in commercial aviation, a man of measured speech and deliberate action who had listened, in the past few minutes, to David Reeves tell him something through the cockpit door that had stopped him mid-sentence. Captain Ellis set down his checklist. He looked at David. He said, "Are you sure?" David said, "I'm sure." Captain Ellis reached for the intercom. The PA system crackled on. The cabin, already quieter than it had been, went quieter still. Pre-departure announcements were routine, and passengers in first class had usually stopped listening to them years ago. But something in the quality of this particular beginning, a slight pause, a breath before the words pulled attention back to the overhead speakers in a way that a routine announcement would not have. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Howard Ellis speaking." His voice was steady and unhurried, the voice of a man who was used to commanding the attention of a cabin and who was choosing now to use that authority for something other than safety instructions. "Before we begin our departure sequence, I want to take a brief moment to recognize someone. This is irregular, and I want to thank you in advance for your patience." Another pause. "We have a passenger on board today, named Marcus Reed. I want to ask everyone to hold that name for a moment." In the first-class cabin, heads turned. Gerald Whitfield's tablet went dark. The woman who had craned her neck craned it again, in a different direction. Several people looked at Marcus directly. Marcus was sitting very still, his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable in the way that the expressions of people who have learned to manage their own feelings in public become unreadable, not cold, but contained. "The first officer on this flight, David Reeves, asked me to share something with you. 23 years ago, when David was a 20-year-old community college student on a work-study program at a maintenance hangar in Ohio, he was 6 weeks away from dropping out. He had no money. He had no transportation. He had no clear way forward." Captain Ellis's voice remained even, but there was something in the deliberateness of each sentence that made it clear this was not something he was reciting from a script. This was something he had been handed and was choosing to give. A man at that hangar sat down with him and asked what was going on. And then, without being asked, without any expectation of return, that man lent him money, drove him to work, spent his own evenings teaching him the material he needed to pass his exams, and called in every favor he had to make sure this kid had a fighting chance. That man never asked for anything back. He never told anyone what he had done. He simply made it possible for someone else to keep going. The cabin was very quiet. "That man," said Captain Ellis, "is sitting in seat 2A. His name is Marcus Reed. David would like me to say, on his behalf, everything I have, every flight I've ever flown, every morning I've put on this uniform, none of it happens without you, Marcus. None of it." The silence held for 1 second, then 2, then someone, somewhere in the middle of the cabin, began to clap. It was a single person at first, their applause sounding a little small and uncertain in the space. But it did not take long. Within a few seconds, another pair of hands joined, then another, then several at once. The sound built the way sound builds, when it is genuine, not the polite, synchronized applause of obligation, but the rolling, gathering applause of people who have been moved by something they were not expecting. Several passengers in first class stood. Gerald Whitfield did not stand, but his tablet had not come back on. And he was looking at Marcus with an expression that had abandoned all of its earlier certainty. The flight attendant had stopped moving. She was standing in the galley entrance with her hand loosely over her mouth. And she was not performing composure. Marcus sat through the applause the way he sat through most things that were directed at him, with a stillness that was not indifference, but was something like the opposite of indifference. A depth of feeling so real, it required absolute quiet to contain. He looked at his hands in his lap. His jaw was set. His eyes were bright. He did not speak. Captain Ellis was not finished. "I want to add one more thing," the captain continued, and the cabin quieted again quickly, the applause subsiding like a tide retreating in preparation for something further. "What David told me just now, and what I suspect most of you did not know, is that Marcus wasn't only doing this for David. He had two other jobs at the time. He was raising a daughter on his own. His wife had passed away not long before, and David was not the only person he helped. Marcus Reed has mentored and financially supported more than a dozen young people who had no other resource, no other advocate, no one who believed they had anything worth saving. Several of those people now work in this industry. One of them is sitting in this cockpit with me tonight. And to my knowledge, none of you have ever heard Marcus Reed's name before this moment. Because he never told anyone. Because that is not why he did it." The captain paused. "That is why I'm telling you now." When Captain Howard Ellis emerged from the cockpit, it was an unusual sight. Captains did not typically leave the flight deck during pre-departure procedures. The sight of him tall, in his pressed uniform, moving through the first-class cabin with the unhurried gravity of someone who had made a considered decision, produced a particular kind of quiet that was different from all the quiet that had come before. This was not the quiet of people who were confused, or entertained, or waiting. This was the quiet of people who understood that something real was happening. He stopped at row 2. He looked at Marcus. Marcus looked up at him. They had never met before this moment, but there was between them the particular connection of men who have been shaped by the same absent third person, who carry, in different ways, the consequence of something one man once did for another. Captain Ellis extended his hand. Marcus took it. The handshake was firm, the kind that means something. "David wanted to come out himself," Captain Ellis said, his voice quieter now. "For the row rather than the cabin. But regulations keep him in the seat right now. He asked me to make sure you knew. He asked me to say thank you in the most public way possible, because apparently he tried to find you for a long time," Marcus said, very quietly. "I moved around a lot." Captain Ellis nodded. He said, "He knew. He said that sounded exactly like you." A few rows back, a man began clapping again. And this time the response was faster. The cabin rising to it with the ease of people who have already done it once and found it felt right. Captain Ellis kept his hand on Marcus's shoulder for a moment, then turned and walked back to the cockpit. The door closed. The applause continued. Gerald Whitfield, in seat 2B, had gone through several visible emotional states in the preceding minutes. His face had done things that his face, given the quality of control he normally maintained over it, was clearly not accustomed to doing. He was a man who had spent decades cultivating certainty about people, about who mattered, about who belonged where, about what the details of a person's appearance communicated about their worth. He was not, he would have said, a cruel man. He was a realistic one. He had looked at Marcus Reed and made an assessment that seemed, in the moment, entirely reasonable. He was now sitting with the full weight of how wrong it had been. He waited until the applause had run its course. He waited until the cabin had settled back into the quieter hum of people processing something rather than responding to it. Then he turned to Marcus and said, I owe you an apology. Marcus looked at him. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, You don't owe me anything. Gerald said, I was not kind to you earlier. Marcus said, No, you weren't. There was a pause. Gerald said, I'm sorry for that. Marcus looked at him steadily and said, I accept that. He said it without theater, without either magnanimity or residual coldness. He said it as a statement of fact, which was the only way Marcus Reed knew how to say anything. Gerald nodded. He looked like a man who had been handed a mirror he had not asked for, and was making himself look into it anyway. Can I ask you something? He said. Marcus said, Sure. Did you know he was on this flight? The co-pilot? Marcus said, No. I had no idea. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Do you know how many people you've helped? In total? Marcus looked out the window. Some, he said. I stopped counting. It seemed like the wrong thing to count. Gerald sat with that. He turned it over carefully, the way a person turns over something they have been handed and are not yet sure how to hold. He had spent his career counting. Everything in his professional world was counted, measured, benchmarked, put in a column and weighed against another column. The value of things was expressed in numbers, always. The value of people, too, if he was being honest with himself, honest in a way he had not been in some time. He had looked at Marcus Reed and run his own quick calculation. He had arrived at an answer. The answer had been completely, definitively wrong. I misjudged you, he said, not for the second time this evening, but more quietly this time, more inwardly. I made a decision about who you were before you opened your mouth. Marcus said, Most people do. Gerald said, Doesn't that make you angry? Marcus thought about this for a moment. He said, It used to. Now it mostly just makes me think about how little we actually see of each other. How much we miss. He paused. I don't say that to be generous to anyone. I say it because it's true. I've been guilty of the same thing, in my own way. We all have. Gerald said nothing, but he nodded, and the nod was real. When the flight attendant came back with Marcus's coffee, she also brought a warm blanket, the kind typically reserved for long-haul international flights, and she placed it on his armrest without comment, without drawing attention to it, simply as an offering. Marcus looked at it, then looked at her. She had already moved to the next row. He unfolded it and pulled it over his lap, several rows back. The flight attendant, who had now composed herself and returned to something approaching professional function, though her eyes remained bright, asked a passenger if they needed anything, and the passenger said no, thank you, and then asked, very quietly, Is he going to be all right? That man in the front. Marcus. She asked it the way people ask about strangers they have just watched go through something, with the sudden, unprepared tenderness that witnessing other people's humanity sometimes produces. The flight attendant said, I think he's going to be just fine. She made her way to row 2 before the plane began its taxi to the runway. She stopped beside Marcus's seat and waited for him to look up. When he did, she said, I'm sorry for earlier. I didn't treat you fairly. And I want you to know, I understand that. She paused. She had been working in aviation for 11 years. She had done this job well, she believed, with care and professionalism, and she had never thought of herself as someone who made assumptions. She was now reconsidering that self-assessment in a fairly complete way. I made a judgment about you based on I don't even know what to call it. And I'm sorry. Marcus looked at her. He did not perform forgiveness. He did not wave it away or say it was fine when it was not entirely fine. He said, I appreciate that. Thank you for saying it. He meant it. There was something important, he had always believed, in the act of someone deciding to say the harder thing when the easier thing was available. It was not nothing. She said, Is there anything I can get you? He thought for a moment. He said, A coffee would be great. If it's no trouble, she said. No trouble at all, and she meant it. There were others, too. A man from the fourth row, not Gerald, but someone else. A younger man who had been among those who had gone slightly stiff at Marcus's arrival came forward, hesitant, before the boarding door closed. He said he didn't have any particular eloquent apology to offer. He said he had seen what he'd expected to see, and not what was actually there. And he would try to do better with that. Marcus thanked him. They shook hands. It was short and a little awkward, the way honest conversations between strangers always are, and it was real. A woman across the aisle leaned over and said, "Your daughter is lucky to have you." Marcus looked at her. He said, "I'm the lucky one." He said it without deflection or performance. He believed it completely. Cora had given his life its direction when it might otherwise have collapsed into grief. The work of raising her had been the structure that held everything else up, the organizing principle that made the second and third jobs bearable, that made the cold apartments and the vending machine lunches and the years of narrow margins not just survivable but meaningful. She had not needed him only. He had needed her in ways he had never once said aloud and suspected she understood anyway, because she was sharp and she had always watched him carefully with those steady eyes of hers, taking inventory. As the plane began to move, as the terminal fell away and the runway lights stretched out ahead of them, Marcus Reed sat in seat 2A with a coffee he hadn't had to ask twice for, and a view out the window that was opening, slowly, into the first dark, and then the city below, and then the emptiness above the clouds. He had come on this flight for one reason. He had told himself a simple story about what the evening would be. A quiet trip. A little comfort. A first-class seat he had technically earned 20 times over, and never claimed. He had not come here to be recognized. He had not come here to be thanked. He had not come here to prove anything to anyone. He thought about his daughter, Cora. He thought about the morning she had walked across the stage at her medical school graduation in a gown that fit perfectly, that she had bought herself, that no one had worn before her. He thought about the expression on her face, not triumphant, not performative, but quietly certain, the expression of someone who has worked very hard for something and has arrived at a version of themselves that was always there waiting. He thought about how, when she had hugged him afterward, she had held on for a long time, long enough that he had understood she was trying to communicate something that neither of them would be able to say out loud without losing their composure entirely. She had said, against his shoulder, "You gave me everything." He had said, "You did the work." She had said, "You gave me everything." They had left it there. He thought about the 23 years in between. He thought about the winters when the heating was unreliable, and they layered blankets on Cora's bed, and he told her it was an adventure. He thought about the years when he ate lunch alone in his truck, because it was cheaper than the break room options, and he was saving the difference. He thought about the evenings after his first job, and before his second, when he sat with David Reeves over a spread of aviation manuals and went through the material with the patience of someone who understood that a young person's confidence was a fragile thing that could be either built or destroyed by the person sitting across from them. He thought about the others, James, who was now a structural engineer in Atlanta, Patricia, who had gone back to school at 35 and was now running a vocational training program in Detroit, Miguel, who had gotten his pilot's license 4 years after David and was currently flying routes out of Dallas. He had not counted, but he remembered their names. He had never expected a public moment. He had not wanted one. Even now, as the plane climbed through the cloud layer and the city dissolved below, he was not sure how he felt about the announcement, about the applause, about Gerald Whitfield's apology and the flight attendant's sorry, and the captain's deliberate, formal act of recognition. He was glad David had found a way. He was glad something had been said. But what he felt most strongly, looking out at the dark above the clouds, was not vindication. It was not the satisfaction of being proven right. It was something quieter than that. It was the feeling of a very long walk that had been worth every step, arriving somewhere that had been waiting all along. The coffee was good. The seat was wide. Outside the window, the sky was deep and black and full of stars. Marcus Reed leaned back. He let out a breath that he felt had been gathering pressure for 23 years. He closed his eyes. Not from exhaustion, though he was tired. Not from sadness, though the evening had carried its weight. He closed his eyes because he wanted to stay in the feeling a little longer, the specific warmth of a life that had been lived without applause and had turned out to be something remarkable anyway. The strange and simple dignity of having done the right thing in the dark and finding out, eventually, that someone had been paying attention. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world without marking it with their name, who helps not because they expect return, not because they are building a ledger of good deeds to be repaid, but because they have looked at the world and decided, quietly and without announcement, that they will try to leave it better in whatever small, specific ways their hands allow. These are people who do not look like heroes because they have never tried to. They look like the man in the worn jacket waiting at the gate. They look like the person who sits down when everyone else has walked away. They look like the hand extended in a break room on a cold January morning, asking, "How much do you need?" They are the ones whose absence would have mattered enormously and whose presence is rarely documented, rarely commemorated, rarely given back to them in the form of anything they can hold. The world is shaped by them in ways that the world itself does not always know how to see. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes something tilts just enough that the light catches from a different angle. Sometimes a co-pilot walks out of a cockpit and stops. Sometimes a captain picks up a microphone. Sometimes the quiet person at the front of the plane gets to sit down with a warm coffee and the knowledge that it was worth it, that it was always worth it, that the weight of it was real, and the work was real, and they are allowed, at last, to rest. The plane leveled off above the clouds. The fasten seatbelt sign dimmed. Around the cabin, passengers settled into the small routines of long-distance travel, earbuds in, blankets pulled up, screens lit softly in the dark. A few of them glanced towards seat 2A with expressions that had something careful in them, something that was trying to be different from what it had been an hour before. One of them, a young woman traveling alone near the back of the first-class section, who had been reading a novel when the announcement came and had not read a word of it since, looked at Marcus for a long moment. She was thinking about her father. She was thinking about what he had given up so she could be on this plane right now, in this seat, going where she was going. She was thinking that she should call him when she landed. She was thinking that she should call him more often. She was thinking that the things we don't say accumulate quietly into regret, and that regret is heavier than gratitude, and that gratitude, offered while there is still time, is the only currency that matters. She picked up her novel. She put it back down. She looked out the window. Marcus looked out the window too, from the other end of the cabin, and he did not know she was thinking about her father. But if he had known, he would have recognized it. He had been the father someone was thinking about. He had been the reason someone found the courage to keep going. He had done it not once but over and over, in the dark, without recording it, without needing anyone to see. He had done it because he believed that people were worth it, that the young man with the library book and the impossible dream was worth it, that the daughter sleeping under extra blankets in a cold apartment was worth it, that the next person, and the one after that, and the one after that, all worth it, every single one. He had never developed a philosophy about it, had never articulated it as a belief system or a practice or a way of life. He had simply looked at people and seen what they were carrying, and he had found that he was constitutionally unable to walk past it without doing something. It was not heroism. It was not sacrifice, exactly. Or at least it had never felt like sacrifice, because sacrifice implies that you are giving up something you would rather have kept. And Marcus had never wished, not once, that he had kept his money in his pocket instead of lending it to a 20-year-old kid who wanted to fly planes. What he had sometimes wished was that it had been easier, that the margins had been wider, that the winters had been less cold and the trucks had been more reliable, and there had been one more person on his side to share the weight on the nights when it was heaviest. He had sometimes wished that Diane had lived to see Cora walk across that stage. He had sometimes sat in his truck in the parking lot of whichever job he was coming from or going to, and allowed himself 5 minutes of something that was close to grief and close to exhaustion, and close to the particular loneliness of a person who has been strong for so long they can no longer identify where the strength ends and the person begins. 5 minutes. Then he would get out of the truck and keep going, because the alternative was not available. He had kept going for 23 years. And now the plane was above the clouds, and the stars were out, and a captain had said his name over a loudspeaker, and a young co-pilot who had once sat across from him in a break room with a sheet of paper full of impossible numbers was sitting in a cockpit on the other side of a closed door. Probably not saying anything to anyone, which was what you did when you were feeling something too large for words. The stars outside the window were very bright at this altitude, freed from the interference of city light and cloud, present in a way that stars rarely get to be from the ground. Marcus looked at them for a long time. Then he turned away from the window, finished his coffee, and let himself sleep a real sleep. The deep and honest sleep of someone who has earned their rest, who is no longer holding anything up alone, who has at last been allowed to simply be carried. Don't judge a person by the clothes they wear, the seat they sit in, or the money they have, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who has already changed the lives of everyone around them and has simply never once needed you to know it.